All right, so today what we have is basically introduction to economics. And then we have the 10 principles. Okay. So, but before we go to these principles and see what they are, what they mean, and how far they can guide or how far they cannot guide, first let us start with the standard ideas. Okay. So, in 9th March, in 9th March 1776, a famous book was published, rather, a book was published which became later famous, and it is an inquiry into the nature and causes of wealth of nations. Causes of wealth of nations. And from that day onwards, this book has remained, it has taken the central position of starting to say what economics really is. And it is by Adam Smith, who is considered to be the father of modern economics. Right? And in that idea, the most important term is, at least to me, is modern economics. So, what do we mean by that? Modern economics. It essentially means that, you see, economy and commerce, they existed probably from the very start, from the very first day when human beings started agriculture. Okay, so from that day on, economy and commerce was always there, right? And commerce is much older than we can actually imagine. Commerce dates back to the oldest of civilizations like Harappa. Okay, and it is commerce where the ideas, or where we find first the numbers, their uses, and also for the first time in commerce it appears, we find the shape of zero. If you look at the shape of zero, it's generated from the days of commerce. It gave us the idea, but that generated from the period of Babylonian period. But anyways, so commerce was very old, economy was very old, and if you look back to the oldest literature, well, the oldest literature obviously is the Arthashastra. Okay, which is written by Kautilya in Sanskrit. Definitely, it is the oldest. But if we talk about the treatment that we find in Arthashastra, that is certainly very different from what we find in Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. Not in the sense of who understood the system better, but in the sense of the questions that are asked and treated, they are very different. Okay, so in Arthashastra we have it talks about the reservation and continuation of many things, including the economics and public policy, environment, okay, assets, a lot of things. So in that sense, it talks also about how the relation of king to its state affairs, and to some extent the employees of the king and its state affairs. It talks about reservation of environment, a lot of things. Rather, it mostly, I mean, in total, it talks about resources and someone who is at the head of resources, and the two angles of polity and economy, they are interlinked. Okay, no one is going alone. So this mixture of polity and economy, which is obviously uh, are very much relevant, because to think of the economy without the polity will be wrong. But anyways, we say we use the term modern economics from Wealth of Nations because the subject in its form in the way we know it. For example, a subject with concerns about individual behavior, and then a subject which is concerned about something called price mechanism, then trade, okay, trade. All of these are dealt in Wealth of Nations. So the treatment makes it a book of modern economics. So the economics that we know today, the primary concerns, rather what should be the primary concerns of the subject, all of that basically comes from Wealth of Nations. Okay, so that makes it that makes Adam Smith the father of modern economics. But to have this idea that nothing was there earlier will be wrong. It's the treatment, it's the separate treatment, more concentration on things that was new. Okay, now if we even consider that the subject started from 1776, in 2020 we have passed a lot of years, right? Okay, so it's close to 250 years. Now in this 250 years, economics covered a huge journey. So for example, when Wealth of Nations was there, even separate topics related to economics, they are treated together. But now we have several branches, and earlier, although it was mainly concerned about production and people and their relation and the disbursement of that production, and then trade and policy effects on that trade, it was concerned about how the market is being able to do what it does. Okay, from that we have come down a long way. For example, in close to 1947, a result showed that one of the prime idea of Adam Smith was wrong. And then now the subject deals with environment. Okay. Now the subject deals with culture and a lot more things. Okay. So in that way, in the last 250 years, economics came down a long road, and it expanded to branches which were even not mentioned in Wealth of Nations. So in that sense, defining or trying to define a subject which has a history of more than 250 years is not only difficult, but it will be quite wrong. Because if you go by definitions, then definitions sort of restrict things. And economics as a subject is still not really old in the sense subjects like mathematics or physics or chemistry is old. So it's still exploring, still going to new areas. Okay, so our objective really is not to trying to define economics, because we ourselves know that it will be largely a futile attempt. But to start with, what concerns us or what makes us relevant, to start with, what makes us relevant is the word scarcity. It's scarcity which makes economics relevant. Okay, so whenever there is abundance of something, then the subject really doesn't have anything to do. Okay, now what do we mean by scarcity? Scarcity is, okay, before we go into that, let me just say two things which you must remember while we study all of this. It is that we are going to go through a lot of terms and a lot of sentences. Now, to that extent, any term that we find in the subject, it is concerned about two things. Number one, as we call it, number one is called annotation. Okay, so we'll be concerned about two things. One is annotations. What do I mean by annotation? Annotation means a note added by way of explanation. So although when we'll be saying scarcity is this, we will actually try to explain it rather than define it in that sense. Okay, because the word and all the words that we'll study, all of them has this property. Obviously, when we'll be asked define scarcity or what is scarcity, then we'll write that. And what we'll write is the annotation, related annotation, that is a note which will try to explain what the word means. But in every subject, their related terms has something more than the annotation. And it is that which we are interested to study, and that is called connotation. Okay, so what is connotation? Connotation is the suggesting of a word, the suggesting of a word, or sorry, not a word, so the suggesting of a meaning, the suggesting of a meaning by a word apart from the thing it explicitly names or describes. Names or describes. Okay. So all the terms that we are going to study, all of them have this layer that we will write something which will be a sort of explanation, but there will be a connotation which means that a suggesting of a meaning apart from that explanation, okay, apart from what it explicitly names. So let's first try scarcity, the most important term to start with. We'll look into its meaning and then we'll try to understand the annotation and the connotation that are related to this. Okay. So what is scarcity? It means that society has limited resources. Society has limited resources and therefore cannot produce all the goods and services people wish to have. Okay, now, so what does this mean? So what we write is a sort of annotation, which again, as I said, we'll be writing as definition when asked. So it means that society has limited resources and therefore cannot produce all the goods and services people wish to have. So limited resources, and that leads to this cannot produce, people wish to have. Now, at first, you may think that the concentration is on limited resources, which creates this scarcity. But if we look deeper, then you'll understand that all the things starts with this. People wish to have, not with limited resources. Because if we can, so with different set of wishes, with different set of wishes, we can have unlimited resources. Okay, and unlimited or limited in the sense of people's wish. So there is no natural idea relating to this limitation. For example, we are not saying that the limitation comes by nature, or it is given as such. What we are trying to say is that this limitation comes because the collective wish, if we want to fulfill that, then the resources that we have are limited. So that's what we are trying to say by the so that's what we say as connotation, that is suggesting of a meaning apart from what it explicitly says or describes. So what it explicitly describes is that there is limited resources, so people cannot have, so there is limited resources, and that's why we cannot produce what people wish to have. Okay, so that's what is explicitly said. But if you go deep, then what it basically says is that the direction is not in this way, but it's the opposite. So if it's dependent on the wish. So let's say we had, we can start with a scenario when some resources were abundant. For example, gold. If we go to the tribal history, okay, if we go to the tribal history, the use of gold that we will find, okay, it was abundant. Why? It's not because people never wished to have it, but because these people, that number was very small. And also, this wish has a different meaning in the tribal society, tribal history, in the sense that their wish of keeping gold was very was of a spontaneous nature. Okay, or the use of gold that today, or after the Western Western not invention, uh, after the Western exploitation of Latin America, okay, the idea of gold that comes up is maintaining the exchequer, connecting with the currency, controlling the inflation, and all of that. That created a different kind of a wish than what you can find in tribal history. So, if you go by the tribal history or the history of Aboriginal people, for them, gold was not a limit. Gold resource of gold was not limited at all. It was unlimited. But then the people, okay, it connected to a group, or people included a group who wished to have gold for an entirely different reason, for its asset value, for its ability to control economy and control people. Okay, all of that, and obviously before all of that, a very higher form of greed, pure and simple greed, that made gold a limited resource. So what I'm trying to say by saying all this is that scarcity is rarely natural. Okay, and in and or even if we consider that it is natural, in many cases scarcity can be created. Scarcity can be created. So if we have enough people, or if we can change the wish, change the reason because of which people want something, then scarcity can be automatically generated. So gold became scarce. Gold was not scarce before probably the Spanish, probably Spain, before Spain attacked countries of Latin America, but it went scarce just after that. Okay, so something happened in that period. So, so that way we understand that what this sentence actually tells us, it has a lot more to tell us, and that goes for everything, every term that we are going to study today. Okay, and obviously the understanding of it is much related to history and the polity. Okay, but then again, following the meaning of scarcity, today the use of gold, obviously today gold is scarce. Given today's use, it's scarce. Anyway, so we can, sort of, we can write economics or the meaning of or what the subject wishes to do in terms of scarcity. So economics is the study of how society manages its scarce resources. Its scarce resources. Okay, by which we mean that if a resource is not scarce, then either society do not manage it, society does not manage it, or even if society tries to manage it, it becomes no concern of economics. But remember one thing, that with our understanding of scarcity, these scarce resources, they are always dependent on the wants of people. And one way of managing these scarce resources is to control the practice of wishing not much. So that was a philosophy, and that was the way uh, in ancient time. But later the world has changed. Later the world changed, and for the last 300 or 500 years, probably, or more than that, let's say for the last 1,000 or 2,000 years, we have a time where the management style has changed. Okay, it not works. It does not really work on the fact that the one of the way of managing it is to control your wishes. It does not say that. What it says is that we have a different way of managing it, and that's the primary starting point of economics, because the subject never concerned itself with the other way, which was always there. Okay. So now we will look into the 10 principles which are related to it. Okay. And we'll cover them in 3 parts. And in these 3 parts, not only we will see what the principles are, we'll also see some examples which show that they work, and then we will unlearn things. That is, we'll also see where they do not work, or where in some sense they are trying to restrict the scope of the subject. Okay. But then again, although we understand, or we'll try to understand the subject in a more complete fashion, if asked what are the principles, then we are going to write what is written here, what I'll be writing. And the examples are obviously will be in the positive directions. That is something which shows that these principles work. Okay. So what are these principles? They are basically 10 sentences, all of which either contains some assumptions or some implications. Okay. So some of them are basically assumptions, some of them are implications, and in that sense results. And these assumptions and these results together with, they govern a huge body of the subject, both in the positive way that they work, and also in the critical way that where they, cases where they do not work, and what to do when they do not work. Okay. So first category, in which we have 4 principles, is individual decision making. So individual decision making. Okay. So what is principle 1? Let's go to principle 1. People face trade-offs. Okay. There is basically the idea of the famous sentence, there is no free lunch. There is no free lunch. Or in the sense that to get something, you have to give up something. Okay. Now, so trade-off basically talks about two opposing forces. Two opposing forces. And in that sense, later we will see that depending on this understanding of this trade-off, basically, obviously related to the decision making. But here we are talking about that people face trade-offs. So in that sense, we are talking sort of a conflict to some extent. Okay. So, and these are not always in the bad sense, in the sense that if I'm going to give something, only if I give something, I'm going to get something. Now, the general idea is that this giving part is painful or something. Okay, but it's not always it's not always that. All right, and if we talk about this give and get, then the most important thing, two most important component of that, number one is money, and money not in the sense of price. There is something, obviously there is price, but this price can be interpreted also as the price of the product and also as the cost. Okay, so the price that you pay is basically the cost of getting something. Okay, so that's the idea here. And there is another thing, which is time, which is more omnipotent in nature than we are ready to explicitly discuss. So basically, no free lunch gives us an idea of payment. Okay, a payment, and payment in form of a lot of things, not only price or cost, but a lot of things. Now, that is a fact for any transaction. So essentially, we are facing transactions, right? What this says is that even if you are getting something free, it is asking you that is it really free? That's what it is asking, right? Because getting something free is so common these days. Right? Free and offer, right? Okay, which kind of counter this idea of facing trade-off, but it's not really that. Okay, so let us take an example where we are trying to get something good, and to get that good, what you are losing is also something good. So the trade-off can be between the trade-off is between the two things, both the things that we prefer. But it's not only that, the trade-off can be also between two things which are bad, and one thing which is good and one thing which is bad. So to get this idea that when you're saying trade-off, whatever I'm giving and getting, it's not necessary that I love both of them. Okay, so let's take an example. All right. So the objective or rather we like write this. So if we want to reduce pollution with better technology, then it is also going to raise the cost of production. The cost of production. Okay. And if there is higher cost, then it has a chain effect. So these higher costs will lead to smaller profits, right? Smaller profits, higher prices, and lower wages, and employment. So you can have all of them or at least one of them. All or at least one. And see, none of them are really good compared to the situation we had. Right. So given this trade-off, one of the important questions is how to calculate the sum effect. Okay. Or the summary effect. How do we calculate it? Given that on one side we are gaining by reducing pollution, but one side we are losing because either profit will be lower or prices will be higher or wages will be lower. So this is the kind of trade-off which leads us to discuss the different ways of calculating the sum effect, because depending on how do we calculate it, the idea of which decision to take is connected. Okay. So now let us move on to a bigger form of trade-off. So probably the biggest trade-off that the society faces is society at large faces is between equity and efficiency. Equity and efficiency. Okay. So let us look at the definitions first. So what is efficiency? Efficiency is let us write like that. It is the it is the property that the society is getting maximum benefits from its scarce resources. Okay. And then what is equity? Remember, this is not equality, this is equity. Equity and equality are two different things. Okay. So what is equity? It is the criteria that benefits of a society are distributed uniformly among society's members. Among society's members. Okay. All right. Now, this is the kind of trade-off which is the most relevant because they conflict. And why? Because this distributed uniformly, it has this idea of redistribution. Okay. All right. And this redistribution, what does it mean? Redistribution means, so redistribution basically means taking from those who has more or who have more and distribute it to those who have less. Okay. So this is the idea. Now, let's first consider from whom we are trying to take. Okay. So we said obviously that we are trying to take from people who have more. Right. Now, that means what? That means that we are asking, so that means somebody who is more financially successful is supporting the welfare system more. Right? So now let's see how that is done. The major instrument that we have is tax, and we must write taxes because there are different forms. So obviously there is income tax, which is we are quite familiar with, but there is something also called a wealth tax. There is something also which is now called CSR. CSR means corporate social responsibility. Okay. So CSR exists well and beyond income tax. Now, this means that from the financially successful, we are basically taking their money and redistributing it. Okay, so that part is fine. So so this promotes equity, and to that extent, it's good. But the area where it is not good is that it is also hurting the efficiency of the successful. Or rather, let me put it like this, because using just the word successful will make the situation more complicated. So the efficiency of the financially successful, by which we simply mean people who have more money. Okay, so And why? How do we do it? Simply tax. What tax does is it taxes does that it reduce the benefits of working hard. Right? So it works as a disincentive of working hard. So it says that and given that, what will happen? People will not work hard, which will result in fewer goods and services. Fewer goods and services. Okay, so this is the way of understanding probably the conflict of efficiency and equity. So in summary, we are trying to uplift the poor by taking from the rich, okay, and we are saying it monetary terms. So although the rich are contributing to the welfare system, okay, but the way because they are contributing through taxes, it works also in the downside of it is basically that we are not really rewarding the rich for working hard, rather we are taking the money, which may result in not working hard and producing fewer goods and services. But there is one issue. The issue is this, that's why I said that there are many more things rather than just what we are saying. So the issue is this: when I am actually giving out to those who have less, what am I doing? Am I giving them that, according to that welfare system, am I giving them the reward, the money, rather, the money as a reward of those people working? Okay. Am I giving them the reward of their works, or am I giving them, uh, you know, like Robin Hood, probably? So if I'm behaving like Robin Hood, then this equity efficiency argument, okay, weighing them is quite difficult. But if I'm giving them instead of work, instead of they are producing something, then we have a better situation where here we are losing some amount of production, but in that we are gaining some amount of production here. So here we are gaining some amount of production. And whether our move towards equity and our move towards closing the debate on this, that highly depends on whether depends on the system following which we are working through the welfare system. Okay, so probably if we are paying against the production of something that the poor are doing, or in form of jobs, then we have a obviously we have a better situation, and we can talk about that. Okay, so there is a relative benefit that we are talking about here. Okay, and there is a, or in other way, we are talking about also the relative loss. So the trade-off, the idea of trade-off is obviously always there. It is there in the individualistic scenario. Also, it is there in the social scenario when we are talking about policy making such as this. Okay, so let us go to principle 2. So he said that during a trade-off, you give something to get something. Now, what you are getting, you know that. But what are you giving? Is it the price that you are paying, or does it include something more? So that takes us to principle 2, which shows us that the picture is bigger. So the cost of something is what you give up to get it. Okay. Now, at first, this sentence is quite innocent. Now, let me just say that when I'm talking about give up, I'm talking about it explicitly. So explicit means something like payments that you can observe, and implicitly. And in that, the biggest candidate is, as we mentioned earlier, time. But there is another idea also related to this. So when I'm saying time, it's not just the time, it's the other possible uses of time and rewards related to it. So that's what I'm giving up. Okay. And to that extent, we again come to the second biggest term related to economics, and that is called opportunity cost. So what is the opportunity cost? Okay. First of all, opportunity cost is an idea which is based on comparison. And what is the comparison? It is the oldest to do or not to do, but that's the decision making process, to do or what could have been done. Okay. So the best way of understanding it, you just consider 1 hour time of your life. Okay. Let's just consider 1 hour time of your life and think of all the possibilities that you have. Okay, all the things that you get as options. For example, or let's say 1 day, if I say that will make the things a little bit interesting. So think of 1 day. What can you do in 1 day? Okay, and now at first, so all the options. Okay, think of all the options. You can play, you can sing, you can dance, you can study, you can read, you can write something, you can go somewhere. So all of these are options. Now, the moment you choose one of them, you are losing the others. And those others are the candidates for calculating the opportunity cost, in the sense that when I am choosing to do something, I am missing the opportunity of doing the others. Okay, so from there arises the opportunity cost. But remember one thing, that if there are identical events, if there are identical components in both the options, then we must not consider them. For example, in this 1 day, eating, okay, or brushing your teeth, those are not something that you can opt out. Those are something that you have to do, whether you go for a walk, whether you travel somewhere, whether you study, or whether you dance. So because of that, ideas like eating, brushing your teeth, bathing, okay, those are excluded. What are included is that if I am going to travel, then I cannot really watch a movie. So that's the kind of opportunity cost that we're talking about, and which makes the other possible alternative uses of time the main candidate. So based on this idea, what is the definition? The definition is, it is the benefit, or rather, okay, let me write like this. It is the foregone benefit, that is benefit that you lose. So it is the foregone benefit of the next best alternative, Okay, all right. So let us take an example, a far more concrete example. So if I'm choosing between staying in hostel versus staying at home, if I'm talking about opportunity cost, then if you are in a hostel, then the opportunity cost is probably watching TV. Okay. Or probably the opportunity cost is, uh, waking up late. Okay. But if you think of food, then that does not come in the picture of opportunity cost, because you have to eat here and here in both cases. So that's not a foregone alternative. So you don't give up fooding because you're in hostel, but obviously you give up watching TV, you give up you give up waking up late if there is an option. And obviously, technically speaking, in hostel you have to pay money for rent, but in your house, obviously you don't have to pay any rent. But there are property taxes which are related to your home. So in that case, they also don't make it here. Okay. So whenever we see opportunity cost, the foregone benefit and the prime candidate is what you could have done with the time that you have. Okay. So now we know we have the idea of calculation of the cost. Now we can go to the third principle. Okay, so let's look at principle 3. Okay. And it says rational people think at margin. Okay. So first let us look at what it basically means. Okay, so first we have to understand what rational people means. Now, mathematically speaking, rationality has a typical definition, which is concrete. Rationality includes, number one, completeness, and number two, transitivity. So we'll discuss them in detail later. But just to say, okay, let us take an English sentence which sort of tries to explain what rational people means, or more like what does rational people do, and then we will connect them to more concrete idea of rationality. That is, it has to be it includes completeness and transitivity. Whatever we are going to write, it will, again, it's like an annotation. It tries to explain, but obviously it's not concrete. Okay, so rational people systematically. So what does they do? They systematically and purposefully do the best they can to achieve their objectives. Given the available opportunities. Okay. So first let us so now what is the most important word here? The most important is best. So who says it will be the best? And even going before that, who guarantees that the rational individual will actually be able to do the best? Right? We just said that people who are able to do the best, but when can they possibly do the best? So that requires completeness and transitivity. So given this available opportunity, choosing the best first requires a ranking. So which one you prefer more? If you do not know that, and that goes for any two bundle. So ranking for any two bundle. So if you fail to do that, or any two opportunities, let's say, if you fail to do that, then there is no point of even try to search the best. And what is transitivity? Transitivity says that a best exists. Transitivity basically says that the best, that a best exists. There will be something which is the best. Okay. So given these two conditions, obviously, one can be rational. Otherwise, he or she cannot be rational. Now, given that somebody is rational, that there is a best, given that the rational person can rank the opportunities and there is a best. After ranking, how to really choose the best? So for that, we have the later part of this sentence, that they think at the margin. Now, before we go to go to unlearning this statement, first learn it. So what do you mean by thinking at margin? It basically means that the marginal benefit must equal marginal cost. Marginal benefit must equal marginal cost. What do you mean by margin? Okay, it basically means that benefit due to having one additional unit and cost of having one additional unit. Okay. Now think of this. There can be other ways of doing it also. I mean, there can be always other ways of thinking. For example, we can think in terms of total benefit equals total cost. We can also think about average benefit equals average cost. And the point is that there is no way that we can say that this one is better and these are not. Okay, so there is no universal way through which you can say that. So when I'm saying that they think at the margin, I'm talking about an approach towards choosing the best. So basically this talks about an approach which is known as marginalist approach. It became popular later. So we are talking about marginalist approach. Okay, so it's not that people actually do that. It's not that even rational people are always required to do that, because for being rational, all you need is you must be able to rank the bundles or alternatives, and there must be a best. But the method of choosing the best, that doesn't include that. That's not precluded in the idea of rationality. Okay, so for that we have different methods, and one of them is the marginalist approach, that they think or they decide using this rule. This is an approach which was non-existent in economics at the very start of it for a long time, and then it came forward. And today, this is the approach that we take in most of the cases. Okay, but that doesn't mean that this is not an approach. This is sort of a reality. It's not. It's an approach. So what it says that you must compare by what you get and what you lose by the one additional unit. Okay, so in that sense, if you think, it has some kind of this, some form of this forgetfulness also, that you had something. So once you you have 2 unit, and then you go to 3 unit, and when you are going to 3 unit, you just forget that you came up to 2. You just think what's changed between 2 and 3, and that goes when you go from 3 to 4. You compare what happens between 3 and 4. You just forget what happened between 2 and 3. Okay, so that's the way we progress. Now, one of the classic example which kind of justifies that this is the best approach that we have, okay, is famously known as water diamond paradox. All right. Water diamond paradox. And the question it asks is pretty simple. It says water is necessary, but less costly. And diamond is luxury. Or should I say conspicuous, but highly costly. So why is that? It's because getting an additional unit of water is easy. And by easy, we mean cheaper. So the cost associated is smaller. So associated cost is smaller. Now what about diamond? So getting an additional unit of diamond is quite difficult. Okay, now in what sense it is difficult? That is the most important part. It's not that you can accept quite difficult, because diamonds come from diamond mines. Okay, so it's not the fact that you pick up one diamond and then you kind of bring out the beauty of it and then you go for another diamond in the mine. They are always discovered in plenty. So why am I saying that this is quite difficult? It's because the want around diamond is much higher than procurement of diamond. Okay, procurement of diamond. That's what makes it difficult. That's what makes it quite difficult. So given one diamond, we have a lot of people who are ready to bargain for it. And this is what makes this diamond costly. Okay, so this is what makes it costly. But then again, we are using a marginal approach. So when I'm taking a marginal approach, think of this. Here what I'm saying that people consider it, right? That having another diamond is quite precious. And that consideration is in effect because this is true. That means even when we are arguing regarding marginal cost of water is cheaper than diamond and all of that, we are saliently assuming that this water is plentiful. Water is plentiful. And if you look at the water bodies today, the amount of the way that they have reduced all over the world, okay, the way we plundered them, we polluted them, that shows that we indeed assumed that water is plentiful, let alone drinking water, what we are considering. Now, if you look at the Chennai drought, then you will understand that sometimes considering this can make the reality quite difficult, right? So because end of the day, what it makes you think is that people don't care about water because they consider there is too much of it. But think of the other way. This is necessary. So if the situation turns, if you enter in a crisis, this whole picture will be completely opposite. But the point is that then again, the idea of this margin will remain the same. In the sense that then, since getting an additional water will be quite difficult, price of water will go higher. So what is the idea? Okay. So what is the idea? The idea is that if we go by this setup, that water is plentiful and people consider the number of people considering diamond to be something to have, if it is more than the procurement, then obviously it can be explained in terms of margin. Okay. But remember, if we go back through what we just discussed, we end up at the starting point that how we are, what is the situation of scarcity. Okay. So given scarcity, we will think of the marginal benefit and marginal cost and we'll decide. Okay. Now, principle 4, which to me appears to a little bit circular. So it says people respond to incentives. Okay. Now, let me ask first, what is incentive? So what is incentive? It is something that induces people to act. So incentive is something that induces people to act. And to me, that's what makes it circular. Why? Because if incentive is something that induces people to act, then what do you mean by people respond to incentive? Because that's the way incentive itself is defined, right? So if people do not act, then it will not be incentive. But then there will be no point of saying that people didn't respond to that incentive. So what we say here probably is, but what we can say here in a better way is that incentives exist. Okay. That incentives exist. That means there are ways and means by which we can indirectly lead people to act. Okay, that's possible. That's possible. So that is more important, because if it's that possible, then that's the best way to do things. Okay. Now, incentive comes with two things. One is desired consequences, and the other is undesired consequences. So it's not really a very straightforward task. So when you are trying to incentivizing people, we obviously we will end up with desired consequences, but we also may end up with undesired consequences. And in that, if the undesired consequences can go over this desired consequences, making making it difficult to judge whether such an incentive actually worked or not. And for that, we are going to use an example which is pretty interesting. It is the example of mandatory seat belt. So much like earlier in India, cars used to come without any airbag, mostly from Indian companies. Much like that, there was no provision of seat belt long time back. And then it was made mandatory. And what was the idea? The idea is that no seat belt leads to more drivers' death, more drivers' death. So now what is the incentive behind seatbelt? Safer driving. And fewer driver deaths. Fewer drivers death. So that was the intended consequences or desired consequences. Okay. Now, is it the case that surfaced later? Yes, it happened in the sense that this was achieved, but something else was also achieved, and that is, if you have seat belt, that means this driver is much more safer now than he was earlier, and that is a great incentive for rash driving. So the undesired consequence here was speed driving, because now you have seatbelt, now you are more secure. And even though there is speed driving, it actually resulted into fewer drivers' death. But what it resulted in is higher pedestrian death. Okay. So that means this is its direct effect, and this one is its indirect effect. So now life of drivers become more secure at the cost of insecure life of pedestrians. So how will you see, how will you say that this policy, did it actually work or not? Okay, so such debates are quite common in economics, and whenever we are making public policy decisions, that is, we are trying to incentivize people, we must keep that in mind. Okay, so now we said that there are 10 principles and we are going to take them in 3 parts. So in the first part, there were 4 principles. We discussed a lot about them. Now let us go to the second part. So this is 3 principles about how people interact. Now remember one thing, when we are writing interact, we are talking about interaction which makes economic sense. So we are not talking about one fanatic interacting with another fanatic of a different group. That's not the kind of interaction that we are talking about here. Okay. All right. So the first is, in our list, it will be principle 5. So what is it? Trade can make everyone better off. Okay. Now this sentence itself again is very dangerous in the sense that obviously everyday exchange of services is beneficial to individuals as working in isolation around all the needs restricts the better off of a family. What do you mean? What do you mean by that? We are trying to say that consider. So, as an example, you can say that take any family. There are a lot of works. So, if we start from ground zero, we have buildings to build, cots, beds to be made. Cots and to be made. Then there are lights, electricity works, cooking, cleaning, and all of that. Now, if we keep a family in isolation and ask them to do all of them by themselves, obviously that's not a good prospect we are looking at. So exchanging services, okay, exchange of services that allow all of us to concentrate on something that we do better, and sometimes if we are lucky we actually like to do, but that also allows us to enjoy a lot of other services. And in that way, all the individuals who are connected to that service, they uh, they're better off. Okay, so that's the idea. But it is also true if we consider two countries. Now later we will study trade theory slightly, at least the outlines, and there we'll see how that works for countries. Okay. But since this idea is basically coming from trade theory, let me just explain what we are trying to say here. So consider two countries. For them also, this argument extends. That is, specializing allows each to enjoy higher satisfaction, higher satisfaction. Okay. But obviously, there is one problem again in this also, is with this everyone better off. You see, when we talk about society, when you talk about the first thing, isolation, family, and all, there obviously everyone is better off when there is trade. You specialize in something, you enjoy the others, and that's true for all of them. That is obviously everyone is better off. But when you talk about two countries, and when you are saying for that, saying that everyone is better off is quite difficult. Why? Because if a country is specializing in something, then that means a country is also moving away from some industry. Now the question is, what will happen to the employment that existed in that industry? So in that case, saying that everyone is better off is quite difficult. Well, defining you know defining the prospects or looking at the production possibilities of countries, that is the ability to produce goods and services, the complete basket will obviously be higher, which will lead to higher satisfaction. But to say that it will occur for everybody, that's a huge claim. But then again, if we take a summative view, then definitely trade can make everyone better off. Okay. So now we come to principle 6, which is markets are usually a good way to organize economic activity. Well, in this principle, I think the most uh, debatable word is good. But before going into that debate of good and trying to understand what we mean by usually, let us first understand what a market economy is. So let's define market economy. So, what is a market economy? So, it is an economy that allocates resources through the decentralized decisions of many farms and households as they interact in markets for goods and services. In markets for goods and services. So basically, it's a long story. But what is happening? Number one, decentralized decisions. So about both farms and households. One of the important word is many, because if we don't have this word many, then this word decentralized will mean nothing. But then again, they are related in the sense that the extent of decentralization is a very important component. That's what we understand first, that the extent of decentralization is very important. But a market economy is something which allows this decentralization. Okay. And we are saying that it's a good way in the sense that no benefit is lost if decision making occurs in this way. And this is something that was mentioned in a different way in Wealth of Nations. So, to ask the question of how this decentralized decision making leads to the good, then we have the act of invisible hand. The act of invisible hand. But taking a later perspective, we are essentially talking about price mechanism. And what is price mechanism? It basically is where price adjusts to equate or adjust to equate let me put it like this, where price adjusts to reach allocations agreeable to all participants. So, in this decentralized decision making, farms and households are the participants. So, price adjusts whenever there is a disagreement in the way this allocation of goods and services will occur. That is, how this allocations will occur. Okay, so it's not that when the economy is allocating goods and services in this decentralized fashion, there will be no disagreement. That's nonsense to assume. So price mechanism said that if there is a disagreement, then price will adjust to reach the agreement. Okay, that's what price mechanism basically means. And if we ask how it is being done, then we are saying that it is an act of invisible hand. Well, at first glance, it sounds like God, but it's not. It's much more, it is much less dignified than that. Anyway, so before going into that, let's just look into it. If I say price adjusts, that means I'm saying price is able to adjust. And that means down the line, somewhere, I'm assuming one of these two things, either price is, yeah, either price is perfectly flexible, or I'm saying nobody controls the price. Because in any of these two, because these two scenarios, they appear basically together. If somebody is controlling it, then it is not perfectly flexible. Right? So when it is not perfectly flexible, we have a difficult scenario, and the principle basically says that it's not, it doesn't happen that much. Right? Now let us look into the invisible hand, and the better way to understand what this is to look at what Adam Smith said, or where does this appear? Okay. So by looking at that, probably we'll better understand. Okay. So first we'll look at one sentence which is from an earlier book, Theory of Moral Sentiments. It came out years before Wealth of Nations. Theory of Moral Sentiments. Here it is expressed in a more beautiful manner. So it says every individual neither intends to promote the public interest, nor knows how much he is promoting it, how much he is promoting it. He intends only his own security. and by directing that industry in such a manner as its produce may be of the greatest value. So that is personal interest and its attainment and not public interest, for both the reasons that the individual does not intend and the individual does not know, or even when the individual is doing it unintendedly, then also he doesn't know. So that means that when I am looking at this purpose of work, that its produce may be of the greatest value, the individual basically doesn't care about the public promotion. Okay, so of the greatest value, comma, he intends only his own gain. His own gain, comma, and he is in this, as in many other cases, led by an invisible hand, to promote an end, which is no part of his intention. Okay. So look at this. To promote, no part of intention. Okay. So the individual never wanted that. The individual is working only his own gain, working for only his own gain, and yet this happens. Okay. A public end is achieved. So how does this happen? To express that, we have this phrase, an invisible hand, where everybody is working for himself, and yet the end result is economic well-being for all. Economic well-being for all. Okay. So this is how we restored the principle that market is usually a good way. Now, as we are saying this, I would just mention that years later, close to 200 years later, when John Nash published his paper, The Bargaining Theorem, he showed that even when there is no visible hand, that is no government or something, even then the opposite scenario could happen. That is, society may end up with a worse result than it could have achieved. Okay, so decentralization may actually lead to nonsense things also. I'm not saying I'm not saying that undesirable uh, is something of a undesirable is something that the undesirability is at two levels. Number one is the one that I'm currently talking about. That is, the market allocation itself is inefficient. Okay. And the other argument, which is more popular because it is easy to understand, is that although it is efficient, it is not equitable. So something being not equitable becomes undesirable. But what I'm currently talking about, Nash's work, is to show that even when there is decentralized version of all of this, okay, no one is interfering and everybody is thinking about his own, it may not result in all of this, this gainful activity. It may result in an inefficient allocation. All right. So even when we are saying that this is our principle, do not think for a moment that this is the only thing that we have. But let's say clear about one thing, that we can have a corollary based on that, which is pretty important regarding the effect of government intervention, something that we'll see while covering taxation. So what is the corollary? The corollary is this: when a government prevents prices from adjusting naturally, to supply and demand, supply and demand, when a government prevents prices from adjusting naturally to supply and demand, it distorts prices, and thereby the decisions of household and farms. Okay. So basically, if we think about taxes, which is the way government kind of prevents prices, or for that matter, price control, price quota, and all of that, basically it distorts prices and thereby the decision of household and farms. Now, do not think for a moment that just writing this comes with a bad feeling. It's not. Sometimes when the second type of undesirability, that the efficiency of market is not equitable, comes up, then actually it's a good idea, although it will distort things. And that leads us to principle 7. And what is it? It says governments can sometimes improve governments can sometimes improve market conditions. Market conditions. Okay. Now, for that, we need to understand a lot of things. For example, something called market failure, which means the price mechanism that we just talked about. When does it not work? And something called property right, which ensures that this price mechanism we can make it work. Okay, so but before that, we must have to learn what is the role of the government.